This podcast is brought to you by Kyoto Japan Automotive Group, a company which I've known personally for over 20 years, and your one-stop shop for tires, batteries, and auto parts. Visit their website at www.kyotojap.com for more details. We'll talk about the war in Ukraine, raging, as you all know, since 2014 with the invasion of Crimea and Russia's unprovoked and illegal invasion of Ukraine's sovereign territory, which, as we all know, took a drastic turn in February 2022 with the unsuccessful Russian attack on Kyiv. It was, if you recall the Russian line, a special operation and supposed to end very swiftly. Well, it didn't. The Ukrainians resisted. At the time of the last interview of my guest today, Ukraine had been let down badly by some countries that had promised military assistance but had failed to deliver. The United States and Germany were, still are, the two countries most conspicuous in failing to stand by their commitments. Well, my guest today is Lieutenant General retired Ben Hodges, former commander of the U.S. Army in Europe and the first commander of NATO's Allied Land Command. He retired in 2018. These days, he speaks for FBH Geostrat Consulting, and General Hodges joins me via Zoom from Frankfurt, where he is based. He's a regular contributor to broadcast radio and TV programs around the world, and is known for his straightforward and knowledgeable commentaries on war and conflict strategies, especially the war in Ukraine. Welcome back to the McKay Interview, Ben. I do appreciate you making time for me and our listeners when you're in such great demand.
Well, Michael, thank you. And I'm glad that after being exiled for 15 months, you let me get back into the queue.
Well, Switzerland almost has an open doors policy, Ben, so you shouldn't worry about that too much. We long to see you down here again. Ben, what I did not say, but I will now so that everyone can hear it, is that you are one of the most downloaded guests on my show. And you're also prepared to admit when you got something wrong. And I recall how optimistic you were on Ukraine's behalf back in October 2022 that Russia would be defeated. Oh, that some of your compatriots in Washington, D.C. had your integrity. And when I watch what is going on in the world today, the words of W.B. Yeats, the great Irish poet, and maybe you read him as a schoolboy, just as I read him as a schoolboy, come back to me. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Ben, so much has happened since we last spoke, January 2024. Give me your assessment of what is going on right now on the battlefield. What does your best information tell you on positions and territory, on logistics, on ammunition, weaponry, special and otherwise, casualties and losses, morale of military personnel on both sides as spring approaches in Ukraine? Ben, over to you.
Okay, well, you're right that I was overly optimistic back in those first couple of years because it was so obvious that this was a great opportunity for all of us in the West to help Ukraine defeat Russia, and that would have such significant positive strategic effect. But what I failed to anticipate was that the U.S. government, the Biden administration, and Germans and some others would be unwilling to do what was necessary to actually even say that we wanted Ukraine to win. And poor judgment on my part about the political will in the U.S., even though I'm proud of what my president did to bring so many nations together and how much the United States and Germany did provide. They failed the critical test of clearly identifying the strategic objective. And I think there's some reasons for this that we could discuss if you wanted. Having said all that, after 11 years of war, and I'm glad that you highlighted, some people don't, you highlighted the fact that this started in 2014. Yeah. That's important because when people say it's inevitable that Russia's going to win, there's no way that Ukraine can survive, or even the current U.S. president said to President Zelensky on that terrible Oval Office meeting when he yelled at him and said, "You got no cards," meaning you've got no way you can win.
Yeah.
We know from history, from thousands of years of human history, that war is a test of will. as much as it is a test of logistics. And clearly, the Ukrainians have the superior will in this conflict. Almost, depending on which source you look at, but British intelligence puts Russian casualties above 800,000 so far. And Russia still only controls about 20% of Ukraine. So, in other words,
800,000. Does that include, I guess, separately, the North Korean soldiers that have been sent?
yeah, the North Korean numbers are unknown. They were, of course, mauled in their first introduction to combat, but it looks that they have re-entered combat, and the reports from Ukrainians are that the North Koreans are slightly better now than they were on their first go. The point is, Russia does not have the ability to knock Ukraine out of the war by themselves. Russia's economy is in trouble. The Russian Black Sea Fleet is nowhere to be found. The Russian Air Force has failed its two critical tasks of achieving air superiority and interdicting the lines of communication from Poland into Ukraine. So
Can I just stop you?
the only
Can I
thing
just
the
stop?
Russians can
Yeah.
do is keep pounding cities and killing civilians.
Can I just stop you there regarding the Russian Air Force? What's stopping that? Given that the Ukrainian Air Force, as I understand, is not flying over Russia, this is an artillery strength. Then is it on the side of the Ukrainians that's shooting down these airplanes?
Well, there's air defense
Yeah.
capabilities, Patriot, Iris-T, and various other systems that have prevented the Russians from being able to fly at will.
Right.
Now, the fact that they have failed to achieve air superiority, which is job one for anybody's Air Force, is also a reflection of the fact that the Ukrainians have taken out most of the command and control aircraft. The Russian equivalent of AWACS were destroyed on the ground. And so without that, the Russians don't seem to be able to operate for extended periods of time over Ukraine in Ukrainian airspace. But it also has something to do with training because they certainly have advanced technologies, but the training and culture that our air forces have about, the operation of going in, suppressing air defense, and then taking out the enemy's capabilities, being prepared to rescue pilots, all of these things, the Russians, as far as I can tell, don't have that, and they have still not developed it. So it's a combination of things that Ukrainians have kept Russia from achieving air superiority.
I see. And tell us a little bit more about what you know regarding positions and territory that maybe we don't appreciate when we look at the maps by all the experts on television, just so we have
Yeah,
a sense
well,
of.
I'm glad you mentioned maps. It's useful
Yeah,
to look at the map, and when you see, and there were headlines for the past several months where the Russians are advancing steadily. But
yeah.
if you look at where they actually are on the ground, that's not true.
So tell me explain that one to me.
Yeah. So I think this is the most illustrative example. February last year, February 2024, I was in Munich at the Munich Security Conference, and there were two big bad news events that happened. The first was the announcement of Navalny having died in Russian captivity. Most people believe he was killed, of course. And the other thing was that after many, many months of fighting, the Russians had finally captured Avdiivka. And so people were walking around like, oh my God, Avdiivka has fallen. And I thought, Avdiivka? And I looked and I got my map. I always carry a map of Ukraine with me. Avdiivka is about as far in the east of Ukraine as you can possibly be. So for years, the Russians have been trying to capture it. They finally captured it. That was February 2024. This February at Munich Security Conference, people were talking about the Russians are moving, inexorably moving, advancing, and they were on the outskirts of Pokrovsk. So again, I pull out my trusty map, I do a measurement. It's 60 kilometers from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk.
Right.
So in other words, in the space of a year, the Russians had not been able to advance the 60 kilometers from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk, even though they had lost probably about 200,000 troops in that intervening period. So the point is, all they have is mass artillery and mass infantry, and they're willing to expend infantry because they don't care about the loss of their own soldiers. I talked to the Lithuanian chief of defense, the former one, and he said, the Ukrainians lost Avdiivka not because they didn't have enough drones, but because they didn't have enough artillery. And so in this period, when the United States and others failed to deliver what the Ukrainians needed, the Russians still were only able to move about 50 to 55 kilometers in the far eastern part of Ukraine. At the same time, Ukrainians launched an attack into the Kursk Oblast, and they were there from August until just recently. So almost 7 months, they had a huge bridgehead or foothold inside Russian territory that the Russians could not dislodge until during the Trump administration, we shut off intelligence for them and other aid to Ukraine. And the Russians, I think they were able to exploit this. I can't say if it was coincidence or deliberate, but it's a fact. So that's kind of where we are. Unlike their grandfathers of the old Soviet army who during the Second World War would have broken through with mobile formations and then exploited it, the Russians, that doesn't exist. That capability doesn't exist right now.
I see. And what's your assessment of morale on both sides?
It's hard to judge Russian morale of the troops. I mean, there's plenty of reports every day you can read about how people are trying to surrender and they get shot by their own side, or desertions, these kinds of things that are happening. On the Ukrainian side, I'd be dishonest if I said everybody was just happy and it was all going swell, because obviously it's not. But nonetheless, they continue to stop Russian forces. There are about 900,000 Ukrainian troops in uniform. Now, there were complaints over the last couple of years about there's not enough Ukrainians. They've got to fix their draft or conscription or whatever. The fact is, they have continued to grow capability of Ukrainian armed forces. Now, what they don't have that most Western militaries do is something that we call the institutional army. That's the army that does recruiting, basic training, procurement, all those things, so that you can generate combat formations. I think they still are working to develop that. And part of the recruiting includes earning the confidence of Ukrainian families that their son or daughter is not going to be shipped off to the meat grinder without being properly trained, equipped, that sort of thing.
Okay. But Ben, I know you're a military man, so forgive me if we just, for a while, just turn a little bit to politics, but I think the two are intertwined. You and your American compatriots now have a new president and team in the White House. I fully realize, as I said, you're a military man, not a politician, not a diplomat. But what do you make of the puzzling, if not bizarre, events coming out of the Oval Office regarding this terrible conflict? And I refer, of course, as you've already mentioned it, to the way in which the president of Ukraine was treated recently, the dismissal of top military officers, maybe some of them were even colleagues of yours, the refusal to deliver armaments. I mean, in my opinion, Zelensky left with his dignity intact when he was in Washington, D.C. last time, if not enhanced, and his hosts presented themselves as rude and boorish. But as an American living abroad, I'm sure you receive many such similar questions. What do you say to those people who ask you, what is going on over there?
I think you just did a very good job of describing accurately the comparison between President Zelensky and President Trump. It's embarrassing. It's frustrating. And you're right. I do get asked routinely, both from friends and informally as well as in formal sessions. Here's what I think. I think that the administration has clearly taken the side of the Kremlin here, which is something that I'd never in my life thought I would see. I do believe that President Trump is sincere when he says he wants to stop the killing. He has a record of being opposed to wars. The problem is his method for doing it is to pound on the Ukrainians versus on the aggressor here. They can't even say that Russia's the aggressor. And so the Russians can see this, Putin is not interested in any kind of peaceful outcome that doesn't include the destruction of Ukraine as a sovereign state. And so they're going to play this for as long as they want because they can see how badly President Trump wants to get a deal for any number of reasons, personal reasons, as well as perhaps altruistic. I think I kind of divide this up, and I stole this framework from President Stubb of Finland. I listened to him at a dinner in Munich this February. He says they're kind of in three phases. The first phase is where we are now. This is the preparation phase. The second phase is ceasefire. The third phase are actual negotiations about the long-term end of the conflict. But the Ukrainians know, like the rest of us, that Russia cannot be trusted. And so they're going to be reluctant to get into real negotiations unless they can see and are sure that the Russians will live up to it. And the only way that's going to happen is if there is a peacekeeping force, not a peacekeeping force, but a ceasefire implementation force that can compel Russia to live up to it. So not blue-helmeted peacekeepers, not baseball cap-wearing OSCE observers. The Russians have zero respect for that. So there will have to be something to compel them to live up. So to take it in reverse, negotiation is 3, ceasefire and deployment of a implementation force is 2. Phase 1 is what we're doing now. It's all of these conversations going on all around us in Kyiv, Brussels, Paris, London, the Oval Office, Riyadh. All of these things are the different parties, if you will, working in their own way towards some kind of a ceasefire and some kind of an implementation force so that then we can finally get to real negotiation. Now, the president and his envoy have been ridiculed. Mr. Witkoff, I mean, I'm sure you and many of your listeners saw this interview Mr. Witkoff did with Tucker Carlson, and he has been mocked unmercifully because he was shown to be he may be a rich, super successful real estate guy, but he's not up to dealing with people like Lavrov.
He didn't know his brief. He didn't know his brief. He hadn't read his brief.
Not at all. In fact, he used Russian talking points better than Lavrov does.
Yeah.
All the nonsense about, how the war started, who's at fault, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the Ukrainians, they're the ones that have the most to lose here. And President Zelensky correctly has decided that they're not going to take a deal just to end temporarily or just to make the Americans happy. This is about the survival of their nation. Yeah. And he can see that the Russians cannot defeat them. And he can also see that the Russian economy is in real trouble. And fortunately, most of Europe can also see this. And most of Europe realizes that if the United States either turns its back on Ukraine or takes the Russian side or turns its back on Europe, Europe is going to be pay a huge price in terms of more Ukrainian refugees, continued disruption of food supplies, no reconstruction, et cetera, et cetera. So Europe, led by several nations, including UK and France and Italy, Finland, Poland, a couple of others, seem to be rediscovering their strategic and moral backbone and figuring out what had they got to do on the assumption that the United States will not be a part of it.
And most of those countries you mentioned are NATO countries. Is NATO safe in the hands of the present incumbent of the White House, even if other member states increase their defense spending? I mean, in other words, is the president good for his word? You said I
mean this sincerely. There's 32
Peace Prize. That's what he says he wants.
There's 32 nations in NATO.
Yeah.
If the United States fails to be active or whatever, that doesn't stop the other 31 nations from the alliance continuing to do what it needs to do, or for them acting in multilateral ways for their own security and stability. They are sovereign nations. Obviously, I think it's a disaster of the first order, or a strategic mistake of the first order, if the United States, for some reason, either actually pulls out of NATO, which I don't anticipate, or begins to minimize its participation it's bad for us, not just for Europe. And that crack in the cohesion of NATO is what would be the most dangerous part of all this. But look, the reason that Trump did not invite Europe to be part of the process is because he has no respect for them. And it's understandable because, I mean, I have to tell you, and I am probably one of the most pro-European Americans alive. I am sick and tired of hearing the whining by so many European countries about, we don't have enough of this. The Americans are leaving us. Give me a break. You know, if you add together the economies of Europe, forget UK, Canada, Norway, just European Union countries, the economies and the populations dwarfs Russia. So Europe does not need a U.S. backstop. It needs self-confidence, and it feels like people are finally realizing that they have to do this. Otherwise, you know, the Trump administration and the Russians will continue to disregard.
Just one last point on this before we go back to military matters. Are the imperial ambitions and the territorial ambitions, even threats to friends of America like Denmark, Greenland, Panama, Canada, any different from Russia's behavior towards Ukraine, plus the other neighboring sovereign countries? What do you think? What's your opinion?
It's terrible. In my life, I never imagined this. I mean, why in the hell would we threaten Canada or Mexico or a NATO allied Denmark over Greenland? None of this is necessary. Zero. I pay pretty close attention to what is going on around Panama Canal. There's no Chinese threat down there either. So this is all theater or in strategic incompetence. Now, I have a theory. I didn't make this up, and I'm sure plenty of other people have thought it as well. It does have the feeling that this administration doesn't have a great deal of respect for or care about NATO, and instead has a kind of an 18th century style view of the world where this whole from Canada, North America, South America would be an American sort of sphere. The Russians would have Europe and the Chinese would have that. I mean, I don't know this, and that sounds almost like a Saturday Night Live skit. But when you watch what's said and what he does, it begins to have a little bit more feel a little bit more plausible. But here's the thing, Michael. I think we're going to learn a lot. And by the way, I was in Copenhagen last week. I had a meeting with some members of the Danish parliament. They are not amused by all of this.
That's what I've
seen. They're also hurt that our vice president would be dismissive of them as a bad ally.
Yes.
And I was quickly reminded how many Danish troops were killed fighting alongside us in higher proportion than even Americans.
Yeah.
I think we're going to learn a lot by this summer. Already, remember, the administration has only been in office a little over 2 months. I know it seems like two years, but it's actually only been about 2 months. And already finally starting to see these famous checks and balances start to come into play. Republican members of Congress are finally raising their head above the parapet. The courts, I think the Supreme Court's going to probably make some rulings in June before they go on their July annual summer recess. I think business people and voters are starting to feel the impact of this nonsense, chaos on tariffs, and also disruption of basic government services that millions of Americans depend on. This will show up at the midterm elections next year. It might even show up sooner. We've got 3 special elections that are happening here this week and next. I think the administration can see that that they are not going to have a unbridled ride over the next few years.
Thank you, Ben. My guest today is Lieutenant General Ben Hodges of FBH Geostrat Consulting in Frankfurt, formerly Commander of the United States Army in Europe. Ben, let's just go back to military matters for a while. When we last spoke, you mentioned 3 things that the Ukrainians needed to do quickly. You talked about fixing their manpower system. That was the word you used. You talked about improving the way they fight against Russian electronic warfare, which you said was more advanced in the West at the time. And you talked about rebuilding their defense industry. What progress, to the best of your knowledge, have they made in addressing these three important matters?
They have actually improved in all three. The fact that they have 900,000 troops in uniform now, even without having fully developed the institutional army that I described earlier, that to me is promising. So manpower is not the problem that we all were talking about even six months ago. It seems to me. Uh, in terms of electronic warfare, I think that the two best in the world are the Russians and the Ukrainians because they're doing this on a day-to-day basis, and each one of them they're using electronic warfare to knock down each other's drones, to jam targeting systems. But again, based on Ukraine's success on the battlefield of stopping Russian attacks, it seems that they have managed to counter Russia's electronic warfare advantage enough that they can still launch long-range strikes against Russian oil and gas infrastructure, as well as tactical formations. I think you probably would find on both sides at the tactical level instances where one side has an advantage, but overall, I cannot discern that one side has a overall advantage one way or the other. I just hope that we are paying close attention to what they're doing and learning from that.
And you mentioned you. Sorry, go on. I didn't mean to
The
interrupt.
third thing you asked about was the defense industry.
Yeah.
Ukraine's defense industry, their production, particularly of drones, but also their own long-range missiles, has improved over the past year. So while they're under attack, civilian infrastructure constantly under attack, they are still continuing to improve their defense industry capabilities. And you've got some European countries are investing as well. They've got technical skills, but they don't have the ability to get to scale. And so this is where I think some investors could help them grow to scale.
You've mentioned drones a couple of times. Tell me about drones. How they change the nature of warfare, and in this particular conflict, what have strategists, officers, and soldiers learned from this war about drones?
Of course, the nature of war is unchanging, as we know from Clausewitz. It's violence, it's uncertainty, it's fog and friction. But the character of war, you are correct, has changed because of things like unmanned systems, both in the air and on the water. I mean, Ukraine's Navy, which does not have ships in the traditional sense, yet they still defeated the great Russian Black Sea Fleet through the use of maritime drones, air drones, anti-ship missiles, and special forces. The drones that we see the most of, it's a by themselves. You're not going to win the war with drones or lose the war with drones, but it has become possible to make so many of these things so cheaply that they have basically, in some cases, replaced artillery or replaced even small arms, where you're seeing videos of individuals being chased down by drones.
I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's not going to win the war or lose the war, but it certainly is causing both sides to figure out, how do you protect soldiers? How do you protect critical facilities? How do you protect civilians from these drones? The Ukrainians are suffering attacks every night now, upwards of 100 Shahed drones hitting Ukrainian cities. The Ukrainians are pretty good at knocking down most of them, but it's very difficult to get them all. I imagine that we're going to see, just as always happens when you have developments of new technologies on the battlefield, the side which is able to adapt the fastest.
Yeah.
Ultimately is the side that will win out. My money is on Ukraine having the ability to find kinetic and non-kinetic means to slow down or minimize the impact of Russia's drone capabilities. Although we are seeing drones that are now controlled by fiber optics, so they're not you can't jam them because they have this kilometers of a micro fiber that comes out the back of it. Um, at the end of the day, and this will be my last point, is even with drones, you still have to have women and men that are properly trained and equipped, disciplined. Almost every video I've seen of a vehicle getting hit by a drone was sitting out in the wide open. The hatch was open, and I mean, these are the kind of things that well-trained, disciplined soldiers don't do.
So you once told me, Ben, that amongst your friends in Germany, because you live in Germany, was no talk of a European army, but I guess that's changed over the last 12 months or so. I mean, what are they talking about now, particularly the people in the military or retired military people that you know in Europe?
They're not talking about a European army per se, but everybody acknowledges, certainly here in Germany, that the German Bundeswehr has to regain the readiness, the Einsatzbereitschaft, the ability to conduct operations. They spend a lot of money on their army, but the culture of readiness has to be rebuilt. And
Yeah.
finally, when you've got civilian leaders like Defense Minister Pistorius talking about this, you can sense that they are once again leaders are getting serious about it. The French, the Italians all have very large, capable militaries. The Finns are one of the best in Europe with their rapid mobilization of reserves. The British Army is way too small for what needs to be done. But so UK is having to go through its own assessment, strategic review to balance requirements and capabilities. But the fact is, the British Army is really small, and their ability to do a lot is going to be a challenge.
You've not mentioned the Turkish army. I thought that was the second biggest army in NATO.
Well, it is, but they are and thanks for calling me out on this. The Turks, our Turkish allies, are very good at fulfilling all of their NATO obligations, even though candidly they can be very annoying. So can we. So I think the fact is, Turkey is has been very good at enforcing its authority over because of Montreux Convention at stopping Russia from bringing additional warships into the Black Sea. I think most of their interest is focused to the south, of course, with Syria, the changing situation there. At the end of the day, the Turks will be a part of whatever solution is out there. I was struck when the Trump administration announced that they were trying to get a ceasefire, at least on the Black Sea. That was done without any Turkish involvement, which means it's never going to work. So I think the Turks are being cagey, but also they've got a very serious domestic problem going on now with the arrest of the mayor of Istanbul, Imam Olu.
Right. That's right.
So the military, very professional.
Last question, Ben. What's the best and what's the worst with all your military experience that you hope for in Ukraine, Europe, and the US? I mean, it's a big question for the last question, but just give me a summing up, please. Best and worst.
Well, the worst thing would be for the United States to continue on its current trajectory of turning its back on our European allies, and I mean that for our own strategic interests. Clearly, the administration is going to shift to the Indo-Pacific region, which President Obama wanted to do until Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. So the fact that this administration wants to do that as well is not wrong, but the way that they're going about it, apparently without much regard for our own interest in Europe and the need to maintain the cohesion of the alliance, I think this is the worst case, and especially if that means not doing anything to help Ukraine.
And the best?
Best case will be my president getting so fed up with the Russians because the Russians are playing him and mocking him that he gets mad and he says, "Okay, fine, screw you guys. I'm going to crush your oil and gas industry, and I'm going to let the Ukrainians have everything they need, because Trump really does want this deal. I think he'd prefer to do it helping the person he says he gets along with so well, Vladimir Putin. But at the end of the day, because he's a transactional president, he could do a hard left turn or a hard right turn, and really change things in favor of Ukraine. That would be okay with me.
Ben, we could talk much, much longer. Talking to you has been fascinating, very informative. I knew it would be. Thanks for making time for me and the listeners. My guest today has been Lieutenant General retired Ben Hodges of FBH Geostrat Consulting in Frankfurt and the former commander of the United States Army in Europe. Ben, a big thank you.
Thank you for the privilege, Michael. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to the McKay Interview podcast, brought to you by Kyoto Japan Automotive Group, a company which I've known personally for over 20 years, and your one-stop shop for tires, batteries, and auto parts. Visit their website at www.kyotojap.com for more details. And you can find more podcasts on Anchor FM. Just Google McKay Interview Anchor FM. Thanks again for listening.